Okay, next we're going to get into maintenance models. You'll see that the goals of this program are the same: bilingualism, academic achievement, and then appreciation of the two languages that are being focused on and the cultures that are tied to those languages. Here the target population changes now. You can see that there's non-native English speakers. So all of the students would be coming in with a native language other than English and being are going to be learning English together, sort of as a non-native speaker. The subject matter, again, academic literacy, is highlighted in the first language and the second language. And here, what is different about this program is that the enrichment model was working to make two populations of students who spoke different languages bilingual, whereas this program is looking for a base of students who come in with the same language background and who are going to be learning English, and that way they're going to be teaching Spanish. Let's say if it's a Spanish-English program, they're going to continue to be teaching Spanish because we know that that helps students in learning that second language. And then when the teachers are teaching English, they're going to do it again in a sheltered way. Usually what happens is these programs begin in kindergarten and go usually end around 5th or 6th grade. And mostly these models are structured such that in kindergarten, 90% of the day would be taught in Spanish, which would be the language that these children or students would know at that point, right? That's the language that they come speaking with. And 10% of the day would be in English. And then as they go up in the grade levels, so like first grade, second grade, the ratio of English to Spanish sort of becomes a little bit more equal. So in first grade, it would be 80% Spanish, 20% English, right? All the way up until 5th and 6th grade, where we're getting 50%, right? So we get 50% of the days in Spanish and 50% of the days in English. And that's where the ratio stops. So the goal of the program is to get to a point where the students are being taught equally in Spanish and English and have been able to learn English through that sort of slow progression into that new language. So because of its emphasis on bilingualism and biliteracy, this program is a much stronger model for ELL students because it provides continued development of the first language. It also is helpful because many of these programs end in 5th or 6th grade, and so at that time, the students exiting from this program would have a really great foundational base in both Spanish and English, and even for academic purposes. And so this should put them in a really great place to continue learning English if they enter into an English-only program, or to pick up and begin in a new bilingual program. Okay, so let's talk about transitional models. So the transitional models, the goal is different now, right? So we saw in the past enrichment and maintenance models, the goal was bilingualism and academic achievement in both languages. Here we see the goal is different. It's English language development only. Okay. Again, the target population is non-native English speakers, and the subject matter and literacy is at the beginning both languages, but the goal again is to get towards that academic literacy in English alone. And the way that this happens is sort of in a similar way, where every year that the child is in the school, and again, it's usually from kindergarten to about 5th or 6th grade, they start at a point where most of the day is taught in Spanish, but as they continue through the grades, they don't stop at a 50-50 ratio with English and Spanish. In fact, the ratio then lessons for Spanish and increases to English, so that once students get to the 5th or 6th grade or towards the end of the program, they're going to be instructed 90% of the day in English and only 10% in Spanish. Now remember, they started at a point where it was 90% in Spanish and 10% in English. And that's why this model is called transitional, because what they're trying to do is transition the English language learner from mostly being instructed in their first language and then having more and more and more exposure to English, and then lessening the presence of Spanish at the end of the program so that they are left with basically English. Although this type of model is obviously better than an English-only model, because at least they are getting some support in Spanish, This model is certainly not the strongest form of bilingual education program, because you are taking away the presence of the first language towards the end of the program. So what ends up happening is that these students are going to get into this sort of subtractive model where they have the potential and capability for two languages, but because that support is being lessened as they get older in that program, they're going to exit out with more capability in English than they would be than they would have in Spanish. Okay, so let's get into the English medium models. Remember that we talked about the ESL instruction model and then the submersion model. But let's talk about the ESL instruction model first. So, although we know that bilingual education programs are much more effective than English medium programs, sometimes they're not feasible. So we know that in a few states there's this anti-bilingual education legislation that mandates English-only approaches. So if you remember the English for the Children initiative that was passed in California, Arizona, and Massachusetts, in those states, bilingual education programs are not allowed unless they're private and privately funded. But in the public domain, you're not going to find those types of programs. So that's one reason why we see sort of more English medium models. We also know that in some communities, educators, parents, or community members may be opposed to bilingual education because of their ideologies or because of their misunderstandings about language acquisition and sort of what's beneficial to support a child who's learning another language. Also, if you notice, the bilingual programs that we went over had target populations, so they needed to have a base of non-native English learners, right, who had one language in common. Or they had to have enough of a population to support, for example, an enrichment model where half of the students come from one language background and half are English speakers and are learning the other language. So in many other communities, there are sometimes just too many languages, too many language groups. And a single school doesn't really provide or can't really be sustained by the number of students that are represented in the community. Remember that you have to have a pretty substantial group of people with that one common language in order to sustain a school and have a program be able to continue on year after year. Moreover, the parents and the members of the community have to be on board, right? They have to be seeking those services where they want their children to continue learning that first language as well as English. So, you know, in cases like that where those things are not possible or they don't, you know, they're not available, English medium programs are the next best option. So in English medium program models, all subjects are taught in English, and the effective programs that offer ESL instruction provide a combination of sheltered content instruction, which we'll get into. So here are some of the different names of common ESL instructional models: content-based ESL, English as a second language, pull-out, push-in, self-contained, and then structured sheltered English immersion. Okay, so these are the goals of both the ESL instruction models and the submersion model. Similar to the transitional bilingual model, if you remember the goal from that transitional model in the bilingual programs that we just talked about, the goal is English language development. But in addition here, the goal is also for students to develop grade level content in English. Okay, so they should be able to perform similar to their peers in the different content areas like science, language arts, history, etc. Okay. Obviously, the target population for these models would be the non-native English speakers. At this point, though, because English is the focal language that's being taught, it really doesn't matter what language background these English language learners come with. Okay, they could be Spanish speakers, they could be Haitian Creole speakers, Vietnamese. You know, they could speak a number of different languages. It really doesn't matter because the program is not picking up on that first language. They're only teaching English in a sort of a supported and scaffolded way. And then again, the subject matter literacy is English. Okay, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about was the different types. So, for example, sheltered English immersion typically refers to a self-contained grade-level classroom for ELLs, where teachers are trained and certified to provide language and content instruction for ELL students. So if you can imagine a program in a school where all the English language learners are placed into one classroom. Okay. Now I'll tell you that this model is not very common anymore, especially in a place like South Florida, where we have so many English language learners that it doesn't really make sense to try and combine them into one or a couple of classrooms and separate them from the other students. But in these sheltered English immersion classrooms, teachers provide daily ESL instruction, and by ESL I mean English as a second language, okay? And they teach the content areas, they teach the science, the history, the language arts by using instructional techniques that help make the information comprehensible because the teacher is teaching in English. And the one area of concern that sheltered English immersion classrooms have is that you are separating ELLs from others. And this is the reason why it's not so common anymore. We know that, given our language acquisition theories, right, we understand that interaction with native speakers of English is very important for a student who's learning English. And so it really is not very beneficial to separate the ELLs from the English speakers when that interaction between them would be really helpful in sort of boosting their learning. Pull-out instruction, we had pull-out, pull-in. So pull-out instruction is basically a common technique or a common sort of program used when there are not many ELLs in the school, or when the ELL has some very particular needs and should be working with somebody more directly, more one-on-one. And so what happens is, for a determined period of time during the day, maybe 30 minutes, 15 minutes, 45 minutes, an ESL certified teacher or specialist will come in and pull out an English language learner during a particular period of the day and work with that student to try and teach them English. Okay, so during that time, they're going to be working on learning English, and maybe it's in the form of reading or writing. Maybe they're going to learn vocabulary or some of the linguistic structures, right, syntax or morphology. But that time is going to be spent learning English as a language, right, not learning science through English. Pull-in is another model. So pull-in is when this ESL specialist would actually sit with the child, the English language learner, in the classroom and help that child sort of be able to complete the tasks that are being given to the rest of the students. Again, pull-in is not as common because there might be a number of ELLs who the specialist should be working with, and so when there's a lot of ELLs, those types of programs or resources don't really work as well. So the most common type of ESL program that exists today, and especially in South Florida, is to have teachers who are certified to teach English language learners. And again, this is why you are taking this class. So as teachers, when you finally get into the schools and have your first jobs, you will be ESL certified, meaning that you can have English language learners in your classroom, and you will be able to differentiate your instruction and design your instruction with them in mind. So being able to make your instruction comprehensible not only to students who speak English, but also to those students who are still learning English and are learning through it, through the content that you're teaching, the academic content that you're teaching. So that is the most common model, and that is why all teachers are required to be ELL certified at this point. Okay, and lastly, the submersion model, I didn't really, there's nothing listed here, but the submersion model, as I said to you before, is not a model that is supposed to exist or allowed to exist, right? We know, we just covered legislation, we know that the submersion model is actually against many laws that have come out, including the 14th Amendment, including Brown versus Board of Education, including Lau versus Nichols, and I think Castaneda versus Pickard. All of those laws are trying to counter this tendency for some schools to not do anything different or to not provide a differentiated program to support ELLs. And so this ends up being a sink or swim approach where there's no real thought or systematic instruction put in to help ELLs advance. Okay, so at this point, I'd like you to start on the first activity, and actually the only activity for this week. And you'll find the document available in the unit where you're watching this video. And what I'd like to do is fill in the table with the correct descriptions for each of the following categories: the target population, the linguistic goals, and the language use policy. This is information that we've just covered, right? We went through all of the different types of models. And you'll find that the descriptions are listed for you on the page. And what you have to do is choose and match which description goes in which category. Okay, so the table looks like this. What you can do is pause your video at this time. Take a moment to try and figure out the program goals and figure out in which category they would go, right? Same with the target population, the subject matter and literacy, and the effectiveness. So you can pause your video, and then I'll come back and I'll walk you through it.